Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote forests of Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1893, and autumn had begun to paint the dense forests of northwestern Montana with brilliant hues of amber and crimson. 17 men from various backgrounds had formed an expedition into one of the most resource-rich yet treacherous areas known as Blackwater Valley. In those days, the fur trade had largely declined from its peak in the 1830s, but isolated groups of trappers still ventured into the wilderness, seeking fortune in beaver pelts and other valuable furs. According to records found in the archives of the Montana Historical Society, these men weren't typical mountain veterans. Most were newcomers drawn by newspaper advertisements, promising substantial profits, a last gasp of the once thriving fur industry that had dominated the American frontier for decades. The advertisement, discovered in a preserved copy of the Helena Weekly Herald dated July 29, 1893, read, "Wanted, enterprising men of sound constitution for winter trapping expedition. Experience preferred, but not essential. Guaranteed returns for dedicated workers. Apply in person to Z. Voss at Northwestern Trading Company Office, Helena." The historical records indicate that more than 30 men applied, but only 14 were selected to join the 3 expedition leaders. The selection criteria appeared to favor younger men with military experience or physical trades, blacksmiths, carpenters, and former ranch hands, presumably for their stamina and practical skills rather than their knowledge of trapping, which could be taught. Only 3 among them had genuine experience in wilderness survival: Zachary Voss, a weathered trapper in his 50s who had worked the Rocky Mountains since the 1860s; Hammond Rutledge, a former guide for wealthy hunting parties from the East Coast; and Silas Merritt, a half-French, half-Ojibwe man who had trapped in the Northern Territories for 20 years. The remaining 14 were what old-timers called greenhorns, city men from places like Chicago, Boston, and St. Louis who had romantic notions of frontier life, but little understanding of its harsh realities. Their names appeared on a manifest discovered in 1956 during the renovation of the old Montana Territorial Records Building. Prescott, Wilson, Gaines, Hargrove, Donnelly, Beck, Pearson, Monroe, Fawcett, Whitaker, Lancaster, Holloway, Jensen, and Caldwell. Further investigation into territorial census records provided fragmented insights into their backgrounds. Prescott had been a bank clerk in Chicago until the economic depression of 1893 cost him his position. Hargrove was a former schoolteacher from Illinois with an interest in natural history. Wilson and Gaines were cousins who had worked as carpenters in St. Louis. Donnelly had served in the U.S. Army until 1891. The others had similarly unremarkable histories, ordinary men seeking opportunity in an era when traditional paths to prosperity had become increasingly uncertain. The expedition was financed by the Northwestern Trading Company, a business established by Voss and 2 silent partners based in Helena. According to documentation recovered from the territorial bank records, the company had invested nearly $3,000 in supplies and equipment, a considerable sum in 1893. This investment covered not only the essential tools of the trapping trade, but provisions sufficient to maintain the party through the harsh Montana winter. The preparatory phase was meticulously documented in Voss's business ledger. Each man was issued a Marlin repeating rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, 3 dozen steel traps, winter clothing, and a share of the communal supplies. The company would claim 60% of all pelts collected, with the remaining 40% divided among the trappers according to their individual contributions. They departed from the small settlement of Pine Creek on September 18, 1893, taking with them 6 months of supplies, 34 traps per man, and enough ammunition to last through the winter. The expedition traveled with 8 pack horses and 4 wagons until the terrain became too rugged for wheeled transport. At that point, they transferred essential supplies to the horses and proceeded on foot along game trails that wound deeper into the mountains. What we know of their journey comes primarily from three sources: fragmented journal entries recovered in 1931 during a Forest Service survey of the region, testimonies from the 7 survivors recorded by a territorial judge in December 1893, and a series of letters written by one survivor, Silas Merritt, to his sister in 1897, shortly before his death from tuberculosis. The initial phase of the journey was uneventful. Hargrove's journal entries from September 1925 describe routine travel through increasingly dense forest, with occasional stops to hunt game for fresh meat. His observations were primarily focused on the changing vegetation and wildlife, noting with particular interest the abundance of beaver dams along the smaller tributaries, a promising sign for men in their profession. The group followed the Blackwater River deeper into the mountains than most trappers typically ventured. Merritt's letters described the area as uncommonly rich in beaver, otter, and marten, but also noted an unusual silence that seemed to blanket the forest. "Even the birds are reluctant to sing here," he wrote. "The quiet weighs upon a man's shoulders like a physical burden." This unnatural silence was the first of many subtle warnings that the trappers either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. According to later testimony from Rutledge, several of their indigenous guides from Pine Creek had refused to accompany them beyond a certain point, claiming the upper valley was a place where spirits walk. At the time, such reluctance was dismissed as superstition or perhaps a strategic attempt to discourage competition in prime trapping territory. By early October, they had established their main camp in a clearing about 20 miles from the nearest outpost. The location was carefully chosen, situated on slightly elevated ground near the convergence of 3 promising streams, with the main river providing a navigational landmark and transportation route should they need to leave quickly. From this central position, trap lines could be established radiating outward like spokes from a hub. They constructed 4 large cabins using timber from the surrounding forest, sturdy structures meant to withstand the brutal Montana winter. The main lodge was built to serve as both communal dining area and storage for their accumulated pelts. 3 smaller cabins provided sleeping quarters with 5 to 6 men assigned to each. According to Wilson's testimony, they completed these structures by October 9th, working from dawn until dusk under Voss's exacting supervision. The first week of trapping exceeded all expectations. Each morning, teams of 2 or 3 men would depart camp to set or check their assigned trap lines, returning before dusk with impressive hauls. Rutledge's testimony noted that a skilled trapper in good territory might typically expect 5 or 6 beaver in a week of work. During their first week in Blackwater Valley, they averaged nearly 3 per man per day, an extraordinary rate that should have immediately raised questions. According to the journal fragments believed to belong to Hargrove, the group divided into smaller parties of 2 or 3 men each, setting trap lines along different waterways. Every 3 days, they would check their traps, collect any catches, and reset them. The early weeks were productive, with each party bringing in substantial numbers of beaver and marten pelts. Hargrove wrote on October 15th, "Our success continues unabated. Today Monroe and I collected 11 beaver and 4 marten from our western line. The quality of the pelts is exceptional, thick and unmarked. Voss estimates their value at well over $30 for today's work alone. If this continues, we shall all return to civilization as men of some means." What the archival records reveal, however, is that the first signs of trouble appeared around October 21st. Jensen and Monroe returned to camp visibly shaken after spending 3 days checking traps along the eastern fork of the river. They reported finding several of their traps sprung but empty, and more disturbingly, discovered strange markings carved into nearby trees. The markings, as described in Monroe's statement to the territorial judge, resembled a series of vertical lines intersected by a horizontal wave, like water flowing beneath many pillars. Voss dismissed their concerns, suggesting the traps had been raided by wolves or perhaps indigenous hunters passing through the territory. The markings, he declared, were likely old trail signs left by previous trappers or native people. This explanation satisfied most of the men, eager to continue their profitable work rather than entertain more troubling possibilities. 3 days later, on October 24th, Whitaker failed to return to camp. His trapping partner, Caldwell, claimed they had separated that morning to check different sections of their line. When Whitaker didn't return by nightfall, Voss organized a search party, but a sudden snowstorm forced them back to camp without finding any trace of the missing man. The journal entries become increasingly fragmented from this point, with several pages torn away or rendered illegible by water damage. What remains indicates a growing sense of unease among the trappers. Hargrove wrote about hearing voices carried on the wind at night, while Beck documented finding their cabin door open on 3 consecutive mornings, despite having secured it before sleeping. On October 27th, a second search for Whitaker yielded only his rifle, found leaning against a tree nearly 2 miles from where Caldwell had last seen him. The weapon was fully loaded and uncocked, suggesting it had been carefully placed rather than dropped in haste or during a struggle. Of Whitaker himself they found no trace, no tracks, no blood, no torn clothing. It was as if, in Merritt's words, the forest had simply swallowed him whole. Voss imposed new safety protocols following this disappearance. No man was to travel alone under any circumstances. All trappers were to return to the main camp by sunset each day, rather than staying overnight at the smaller outposts they had established along their trap lines. Firearms were to be kept loaded at all times, and at least 2 men would remain in the main camp on rotation to secure their accumulated pelts and supplies. Despite these precautions, the atmosphere in the camp deteriorated rapidly. Hargrove's journal entry from October 30th describes an argument between Voss and Rutledge regarding the wisdom of continuing the expedition. Rutledge, apparently unsettled by Whitaker's disappearance, advocated for abandoning the valley before winter fully set in. Voss, however, insisted that one missing man was an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in such remote territory, and certainly not justification for abandoning what was proving to be the most profitable trapping expedition of his career. On November 5th, Donnelly, Holloway, and Pearson vanished while checking traps near a ravine approximately 4 miles west of the main camp. When they failed to return by nightfall, Voss immediately organized 2 search parties, one led by himself and the other by Rutledge. They found the men's overnight camp intact, fire still smoldering, coffee pot still warm, their bedrolls laid out but unused. Their rifles and packs were discovered neatly arranged at their campsite, as if they had methodically unpacked and then simply walked away. The search parties found only a single set of unusual tracks leading away from the site, described in Merritt's letters as wider than any human foot, yet too small for a bear, with an unusual gait that suggested neither man nor any animal I've encountered in 30 years of wilderness life. The disappearances continued throughout November. Lancaster was found dead on November 12th beside a frozen stream, his body unmarked except for an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. According to Merritt's account, Lancaster's hair had turned completely white, though he had been a man of only 35 with dark brown hair the day before. The territorial medical examiner later listed his cause of death as failure of the heart, brought on by extreme fright, though modern analysis would likely suggest hypothermia or a sudden cardiac event. On November 15th, Fawcett vanished from his bunk during the night, leaving behind only a few drops of blood on his blanket. The cabin had been locked from the inside, with no windows disturbed and no footprints in the fresh snow surrounding the structure. His bunk mates, Wilson, Gaines, and Beck, claimed to have heard nothing during the night, though Beck later admitted to having been awakened briefly by what he described as a sound like wind passing through a narrow canyon, though the air outside was still. By November 20th, only 11 of the original 17 remained. The survivors had abandoned the outlying cabins and consolidated in the main lodge, establishing a constant watch rotation. The journal describes the atmosphere as unbearable tension, with men jumping at shadows and arguing over the smallest matters. Hargrove's final journal entry, dated November 23rd, reads, "The silence has become oppressive. Even our voices seem swallowed by it, as if the very air resists the vibration of sound. Boss insists we continue our work, though half the men now refuse to venture beyond sight of the camp. Last night Monroe claimed to see tall shapes moving among the distant trees. Rutledge silenced him, but the fear in his eyes suggested he had seen them too." A gap in the documentary record follows, with no written accounts surviving from November 24th through December 7th. What transpired during these critical 2 weeks can only be pieced together from later testimonies, which contain significant inconsistencies and contradictions. Rutledge claimed they continued limited trapping operations within a half-mile radius of the main camp. Wilson and Gaines described a period of virtual siege, with the men huddled in the main lodge, venturing out only for essential firewood and water. Merritt's letters suggest something between these extremes, cautious excursions by day, followed by increasingly disturbed nights. All accounts agree, however, on the events of December 8th. What we know from these testimonies is that the remaining trappers were awakened shortly after midnight by what they described as a sound like the wind passing through thousands of hollow reeds, though not a branch moved on the trees outside. Rutledge, who was on watch, claimed to see something moving between the trees, though he couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on what exactly he witnessed. Beck, in a rare lucid moment during his later confinement at the Montana Territorial Asylum, provided the most detailed account of that night. They were like men, but not men, tall and thin as saplings, with limbs that moved wrong, like they had too many joints. They stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond where the firelight reached, not hiding, just watching. There were more of them than I could count. And they made that sound, that terrible whistle that wasn't coming from any mouths I could see. Whatever occurred that night sent the group into a panic. They abandoned camp before dawn, leaving behind most of their supplies and all of their hard-earned furs. According to Merritt, Voss had intended to lead them south along the river toward Pine Creek, but in their haste and terror, several men fled in different directions. The group fragmented further when a blizzard descended without warning around noon on December 9th, reducing visibility to mere feet and disorienting even Voss and Rutledge, despite their considerable wilderness experience. The exact events of the next 8 days remain unclear. The 7 survivors who eventually reached safety did so separately or in pairs, each following different routes out of the valley. Their accounts of this period contain significant discrepancies, suggesting either confusion due to exhaustion and exposure or deliberate obfuscation of events too disturbing or implausible to report. Voss claimed to have maintained a southerly course despite the blizzard, using his compass and occasional glimpses of ridgelines to navigate. According to his testimony, he encountered Wilson and Gaines on the 3rd day, huddled in a natural rock shelter near the river. The 3 men continued together, subsisting on a handful of jerky Voss had stuffed into his pockets during their hasty departure from camp. Rutledge's account described becoming separated from the main group almost immediately when the blizzard hit. He sheltered alone for 2 days in a hollow log before continuing eastward, guided by the rising sun on clear mornings. He reported no unusual encounters during this time, attributing his survival to decades of wilderness experience and the good fortune of finding an abandoned Native American cache containing dried berries and smoked fish. Merritt's letters offer the most disturbing narrative of the escape. He wrote of traveling for days without rest, convinced he was being pursued through the forest. "They never showed themselves clearly," he wrote, always remaining just at the edge of vision, tall shadows slipping between distant trees. "But I could hear them, that wind-like whistle growing louder whenever I stopped to rest. Only continuous movement seemed to keep them at a distance. Beck provided no coherent account of his journey. When questioned, he would either lapse into unintelligible muttering or violent outbursts. The physician who examined him upon his arrival in Pine Creek noted severe frostbite on his extremities, as well as a peculiar pattern of shallow parallel cuts across his back, as if made by something with multiple fine claws, yet too precisely spaced to be the work of any known predator. Prescott was discovered unconscious by a hunting party approximately 12 miles south of Blackwater Valley. When revived, he claimed to have no memory of events after the night of December 8th. Medical examination revealed a severe concussion and a strange circular burn on his right palm, roughly the size of a silver dollar. The burn showed an intricate pattern that the examining physician compared to frost formations on a window pane. 7 men eventually staggered into Pine Creek on December 17, 1893, having made their way separately or in small groups through nearly 50 miles of wilderness in the midst of early winter conditions. They arrived suffering from frostbite, malnutrition, and what the local physician described as severe nervous exhaustion. These survivors, Voss, Merritt, Rutledge, Wilson, Gaines, Beck, and Prescott, gave conflicting accounts of what had transpired in the forest. The territorial authorities conducted a brief investigation, taking formal statements from each survivor. These documents, preserved in the Helena archives, reveal the official narrative that quickly coalesced around the incident. Voss maintained they had been beset by a particularly cunning group of thieves, possibly renegade trappers or indigenous people defending territorial grounds. He suggested that Whitaker and the others had been killed for their weapons and pelts, though he couldn't explain why the rifles had been left behind, or why Lancaster's body showed no signs of violence. Prescott and Wilson blamed wild animals, perhaps a pack of unusually aggressive wolves driven to unusual behavior by early winter hunger. They pointed to the tracks found near the abandoned camp as evidence, though neither could explain the precise nature of these tracks when pressed for details. Gaines initially supported the animal attack theory, but later amended his statement to suggest some kind of poisoning, perhaps from contaminated water or toxic plants, that had caused hallucinations and disoriented behavior, leading to fatal accidents. This explanation gained some traction with the territorial judge, who noted in his summary that the isolation and harsh conditions of wilderness life, combined with potential toxins unknown to medical science, provide a rational basis for the unfortunate events described. Beck refused to speak at all about the events, responding to questions with distant stares or unintelligible muttering. He suffered a complete mental breakdown 3 months later, spending the remainder of his life in the Montana Territorial Asylum. Asylum records indicate he was subject to violent episodes triggered by darkness or the sound of wind. His attending physician noted that in his more coherent moments, Beck would draw the same pattern repeatedly, vertical lines crossed by a horizontal wave, matching the description of the markings found on trees near the trappers' camp. Rutledge provided the most pragmatic testimony, suggesting a combination of natural hazards, wildlife encounters, and the psychological strain of isolation had led to a series of tragic accidents and poor decisions. Having guided wealthy eastern hunters for many years, he was particularly credible to the territorial authorities, who were eager to avoid sensationalistic explanations that might discourage future investment in the region. But it was Merritt's letters, written years later, when he no longer feared legal repercussions or public ridicule, that provide the most disturbing perspective. In his correspondence to his sister, he wrote, "What follows us cannot be seen clearly in daylight. It dwells in the spaces between shadows, watching and waiting. The others refuse to acknowledge what we encountered, but I know the truth of it. The forest has guardians older than the trees themselves, and we trespassed in their domain." He elaborated further in his final letter, dated January 1897. "I have seen them 3 times since our return, once reflected in my window glass when I was certain I was alone. once standing among the trees behind my home in Missoula, motionless as the trunks themselves, until I blinked, and they were gone. And once in my dreams, where they spoke without speaking, telling me they have not forgotten our trespass. They reminded me that distance means nothing to them, that they can traverse the space between heartbeats. They are patient. They will wait until I am alone. The official investigation concluded that the missing men had likely perished from exposure or animal attacks, common dangers in the unforgiving wilderness. The case was officially closed in February 1894, with death certificates issued for the 10 missing men despite the absence of recovered remains. The Northwestern Trading Company filed an insurance claim for lost equipment and personnel, which was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. What makes this incident particularly unsettling, however, are the connections that emerged decades later. In 1931, during an archaeological survey of Native American sites in the region, Professor Maxwell Harrison from the University of Montana discovered a series of pictographs in a cave approximately 5 miles from where the trappers' camp had been located. The images, estimated to be at least 300 years old, depicted tall, elongated figures surrounding smaller human forms. According to Harrison's notes, his indigenous guide refused to translate the accompanying symbols, saying only that they referred to those who dwell between, entities that his people avoided by never staying in the Blackwater Valley for more than 3 days. Harrison's full report, submitted to the University of Montana Anthropology Department, contained detailed sketches of the pictographs and extensive notes on their possible interpretations. However, when the report was published in academic journals later that year, these specific findings were conspicuously absent. When Harrison inquired about the omission, he was informed that those sections were considered speculative and potentially misleading by the editorial board. Intrigued by this censorship, Harrison returned to the site in the spring of 1932 with a photographer to document the pictographs more thoroughly. According to his personal correspondence, preserved in the university archives, they found the cave entrance collapsed under an apparently recent rock slide. No subsequent expedition has relocated the site. The indigenous peoples who had inhabited the region for countless generations, long before European settlement, maintained a complex relationship with Blackwater Valley. Oral histories collected from Kootenai tribal elders in the early 20th century describe the area as simultaneously sacred and forbidden, a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, especially during the dark of winter. According to these accounts, the valley had once been the site of an ancient settlement abandoned after a series of inexplicable disappearances. The remaining inhabitants conducted elaborate rituals before departing, placing protective symbols at the valley's natural entrances to contain what they believed dwelled within. These symbols, resembling vertical lines crossed by a horizontal wave, represented barriers between the world of humans and the realm of entities they called the Tall Ones, who stand between trees. Tribal taboos strictly prohibited remaining in the valley after sunset, or for more than 3 consecutive days. Those who violated these prohibitions were said to attract the attention of the Tall Ones, who would first observe from a distance, then gradually draw closer, eventually taking the trespassers to walk the spaces between moments, never to be seen again in the world of the living. When early fur traders and explorers began to penetrate the region in the early 19th century, indigenous guides would often refuse to lead expeditions into Blackwater Valley, or would insist on elaborate protective rituals before proceeding. Several early accounts describe native guides abandoning their employers rather than entering the valley, despite threats of non-payment or even violence. In 1947, another trapping expedition ventured into the same region, unaware of its history. Like their predecessors, they reported unusual success in their early weeks, followed by increasingly disturbing incidents. Their camp was repeatedly disturbed overnight, with equipment moved or arranged in geometric patterns. Strange sounds echoed through the valley at night. 3 of their party disappeared while checking a trap line near the eastern fork of the river. precisely where Jensen and Monroe had reported finding the strange tree markings in 1893. The remaining members abandoned the area in late November, leaving behind most of their equipment in their haste to depart. Their accounts, recorded by a journalist for the Montana Standard, described hearing voices in the wind and finding their traps moved or arranged in peculiar patterns overnight. The newspaper article was scheduled to run in December 1947, but was pulled at the last minute without explanation. The journalist, Martin Crenshaw, was reassigned to cover local sports and never published another investigative piece. Perhaps most compelling is the Journal of Forest Service Ranger Darius Collins, who in 1962 was dispatched to the area to assess timber resources. His log, now preserved in the Montana Historical Archives, documents his growing unease during his 2-week survey. There's something profoundly wrong with the silence here. It's not the absence of sound. It's the sense that something is actively consuming it. I've worked in remote wilderness for 23 years and have never experienced anything like this. Collins reported finding unusual arrangements of stones and branches near his campsites each morning, though he had heard no movement during the night. On the 8th day of his survey, he discovered a series of marks carved into a large ponderosa pine, vertical lines crossed by a horizontal wave, identical to those described by Monroe in 1893. Collins, who had no knowledge of the earlier expedition, sketched the markings in his journal with a note: man-made, but not recent. The cuts have aged significantly, yet they remain deeper and more distinct than would be expected after decades of exposure. His final entry, dated September 28, 1962, reads, "I'm not alone here. I catch glimpses of movement just beyond my field of vision. Last night I dreamed of tall figures standing motionless around my tent. When I woke, I found perfect circles of frost on the ground in exactly those positions. I'm leaving today. Assignment be damned." Collins submitted his resignation from the Forest Service upon his return to Helena. When questioned by his superiors about his incomplete survey, he refused to provide details, stating only that some places should remain untouched. He moved to Arizona shortly thereafter and never returned to Montana. The Blackwater Valley was officially closed to commercial activity in 1965, ostensibly for environmental conservation. Today it forms part of a federal wilderness preserve, with limited access granted only to scientific research teams with special permits. Forest Service rangers enforce these restrictions with unusual diligence, turning away even experienced hikers and naturalists with minimal explanation. The official designation documents cite sensitive ecological systems and critical habitat for endangered species as justification for the restricted status. However, internal Forest Service memoranda obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1998 reveal additional concerns: anomalous magnetic field readings that disrupt compass navigation, unusually high rates of equipment failure, and multiple instances of research team members experiencing acute psychological distress while working in the area. What truly happened to the 10 trappers who never emerged from the forest in 1893 remains one of Montana's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The official records attribute their fate to the natural dangers of wilderness survival in the harsh winter conditions. But those who have studied the case more deeply point to the consistent patterns of unusual occurrences, the strange pictographs, and the testimonies of indigenous peoples who avoided the region long before European settlers arrived. Of the 7 survivors, all died within 15 years of the incident. Zachary Voss, the experienced trapper who had organized the expedition, was found dead in his Helena home in 1896, apparently having taken his own life. According to the coroner's report, he had barricaded himself in his bedroom, nailing blankets over all his windows and jamming furniture against the door. His landlady reported that in his final weeks he had refused to sleep after sunset, maintaining lamps burning throughout the night. A journal found among his possessions contained increasingly paranoid entries about being watched and figures that stand in the corners when the light dims. Hammond Rutledge, once renowned for his woodland skills, became a recluse after returning from Blackwater Valley. He abandoned his guiding business despite numerous offers from wealthy clients and purchased an isolated cabin in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. According to local accounts, he built his home with no windows on the north side, the direction of Blackwater Valley, and surrounded it with elaborate arrangements of stones and branches that he maintained with obsessive precision. He disappeared during a solo hunting trip in 1901. Despite an extensive search, only his rifle was recovered, leaning carefully against a tree with all its ammunition removed. Wilson and Gaines, the Carpenter cousins, returned to St. Louis, where they established a modestly successful furniture business. Both became known for their excessive drinking and erratic behavior. Wilson died in 1905 from liver failure, while Gaines was killed in a workshop accident in 1908. The attending physician noted that the nature of Gaines's injuries suggested he had deliberately placed his hand in a mechanical saw, though no suicidal intent was officially recorded. Prescott, the former bank clerk, invested his share of the insurance settlement in a small mercantile business in Butte. By all accounts, he was the only survivor who managed to build a stable life after the incident, though colleagues noted his peculiar habit of constantly repositioning himself to keep his back against walls and his irrational fear of forests. He died in 1907 from pneumonia contracted after becoming lost in a blizzard less than a mile from his home, an unlikely fate for someone with his wilderness experience, unless he had been disoriented by something other than the weather. Beck remained in the Territorial Asylum until his death in 1902. His medical records document a consistent pattern of night terrors and violent reactions to certain stimuli, particularly the sound of wind through trees and the sight of tall, thin objects like fence posts or birch trees. His attending physician, Dr. Malcolm Werner, became sufficiently intrigued by Beck's case to compile extensive notes on his ravings and recurring delusions. Werner's manuscript, titled Manifestations of Wilderness Psychosis in Traumatized Subjects, was never published and disappeared from the asylum archives sometime in the 1920s. Silas Merritt, whose letters provide the most detailed account, died of tuberculosis in a sanatorium near Missoula in 1897. The nurse who attended him in his final days reported that his last words were, "They're still watching." They never stopped. When asked who he meant, he simply pointed toward the window, though nothing was visible but the distant line of trees marking the edge of the forest. The most disturbing aspect of Merritt's case emerged decades later, when his personal effects were discovered in the sanatorium's unclaimed property repository during a building renovation in 1978. Among his possessions was a small leather pouch containing a carved wooden figure approximately 6 inches tall. The figure depicted an elongated, thin humanoid form with disproportionately long limbs and no discernible facial features. Attached was a note in Merritt's handwriting. "It has found me. Disappeared on my nightstand yesterday. No one admits to placing it there." The figure was transferred to the Montana Historical Society collection, but disappeared from their inventory in 1981. The curator responsible for the collection denied any knowledge of its removal, though she later requested a transfer to another department, reportedly after finding a similar figure on her desk one morning with no explanation of how it had arrived. In the decades since, numerous theories have attempted to explain what befell the trappers of Blackwater Valley. Some suggest they fell victim to territorial disputes with other trappers or indigenous groups protecting sacred land. According to this theory, the survivors concocted more mysterious explanations to avoid potential legal consequences or to obscure their own roles in conflicts that may have turned violent. Others propose more mundane explanations: carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated cabins causing hallucinations, ergot fungus contaminating their food supplies, or simply the psychological strain of isolation in the wilderness affecting men unaccustomed to such conditions. These rational explanations have satisfied many historians and helped relegate the incident to a footnote in Montana's frontier history. Yet these explanations fail to account for the recurrence of similar patterns in subsequent expeditions to the region, or the consistent descriptions of certain phenomena across decades, the unusual silence, the sense of being watched, the strange markings and arrangements of objects, the sounds carried on the wind at night. Perhaps most telling is the 1967 interview with Wilson Blackfoot, an elder of the Kootenai tribe, recorded as part of an oral history project. When asked about the Blackwater Valley, he said, "Our people have always known that place is forbidden. The ancient ones who dwell there do not sleep or die as we do. They exist between moments, watching from the spaces we cannot perceive. Those who linger too long in their domain become aware of their presence, and once you see them, they never stop seeing you." When pressed for details about these ancient ones, Blackfoot became visibly uncomfortable and refused to elaborate, saying only, "Some knowledge is dangerous merely in the having. To speak their nature aloud is to invite their attention." "I have said too much already." The interviewer noted that Blackfoot insisted on performing a purification ritual immediately following their conversation and refused all subsequent requests to revisit the topic. The Forest Service records show that since the area was closed to commercial activity, 6 hikers and researchers have gone missing within its boundaries, despite the restricted access. In each case, extensive searches recovered no remains, only personal items arranged in careful patterns at abandoned campsites, cameras placed lens down in the center of a circle of stones, notebooks opened to blank pages with pens placed precisely perpendicular to the binding, sleeping bags laid out and zipped as if occupied yet empty. The last documented incident occurred in 1988, when wildlife biologist Meredith Chambers disappeared during a population study of pine martens. Her research assistant reported that in the days before her disappearance, Chambers had become increasingly agitated, claiming to hear whispering voices at night and finding their equipment rearranged each morning. The official report concluded she was likely the victim of a bear attack, though no physical evidence supported this conclusion. In a particularly unsettling detail, Chambers's final journal entry, dated the night before she vanished, contained a rough sketch of tall, thin figures standing among trees, with a note, "They only move when I'm not looking directly at them. The moment my focus shifts, they're closer. I tried photographing them, but the film shows only empty forest." Reynolds, her assistant, doesn't see them at all and thinks I'm suffering from sleep deprivation. Maybe I am, but if not, God help me, what happens when they finally reach my tent? Today, the Blackwater Valley remains largely unexplored. Advanced satellite imaging reveals it as a dark patch amid the mapped wilderness of Montana, a place where, for reasons never officially explained, GPS systems frequently malfunction and radio communications become distorted by unusual interference patterns. Government geological surveys note anomalous features in the valley's topography that don't correspond to any known natural formation processes, though these observations are relegated to technical appendices rarely accessed by the public. In 2012, a proposed research expedition by the University of Montana Department of Environmental Sciences was abruptly canceled after receiving full approval and funding. The official explanation cited logistical challenges and reassessment of research priorities. However, leaked internal emails suggest intervention from unnamed federal agencies concerned about potential security issues and sensitive historical contexts that made the location unsuitable for standard academic inquiry. The Northwestern Trading Company closed permanently in 1894, following Voss's insurance settlement. Its financial records, recovered during a bank liquidation in 1926, showed substantial investments in the expedition, far more than seemed warranted for a simple trapping venture. More puzzling were the notations in Voss's personal ledger, which referenced payments to an unnamed consultant who had provided specific guidance regarding the Blackwater Valley location. Further investigation revealed that prior to organizing the expedition, Voss had acquired several rare manuscripts from a private collector in Boston, including a partial translation of Kootenai oral histories and a journal purportedly written by a Jesuit missionary who had traveled through the region in the 1830s. The missionary's account described encountering entities that dwell in the spaces between trees, visible only from the corner of one's vision, that whisper knowledge of things no mortal should comprehend. The last official document related to the incident is a brief note in the territorial governor's correspondence from March 1894, denying a request from Gaines and Wilson for a militia expedition to recover the bodies of their missing companions. The governor's response stated simply, "Given the reports from local indigenous leaders regarding the area in question, and upon consultation with territorial surveyors, I must decline the petition. Some places are best left undisturbed." In 1997, an anonymous donor funded a memorial plaque listing the names of the 10 men who vanished. It stands in a small park in Helena, largely forgotten except by those who study the darker chapters of Montana's history. The plaque bears a simple inscription below the names, "Lost to the Silence of Blackwater Valley, 1893. Visitors to the memorial occasionally report unusual experiences, watches that stop for precisely 17 minutes before resuming normal function, compasses that spin erratically when placed near the plaque, and most commonly, the distinct sensation of being observed by unseen presences that vanish when directly confronted. Park maintenance workers refuse to tend the area after sunset, though none will explicitly state their reasons for this policy. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this century-old mystery is not what the historical record tells us, but what it doesn't. The consistent redactions in official reports, the missing pages from journals, the sealed sections of Forest Service surveys, all suggest a deliberate effort to minimize certain aspects of the incident and subsequent investigations. In 2005, historian Margaret Leighton attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Blackwater Valley incident as part of a broader study of frontier-era disappearances. Despite her academic credentials and institutional backing, she encountered what she described as extraordinary resistance from various government agencies. Records that should have been readily available were declared missing or classified. Interviews with Forest Service personnel were canceled without explanation. Her research funding was abruptly withdrawn 6 months into the project. Leighton persisted independently, publishing her preliminary findings in an obscure academic journal. 3 weeks after publication, she reported a break-in at her home office. Nothing of value was taken, but all her research materials related to Blackwater Valley disappeared, including electronic files that had been selectively deleted from both her computer and backup drives. Shortly thereafter, she accepted a visiting professorship in England and has not returned to the subject. The most convincing argument for a supernatural explanation comes not from folklore or superstition, but from the pattern of documented phenomena that defies conventional understanding. The consistent descriptions across decades and from unrelated sources suggest something beyond coincidence or cultural transmission. The unusual magnetic anomalies, the equipment failures, the precise arrangements of abandoned possessions all point to an intelligence at work that operates according to rules we do not comprehend. According to Dr. Eleanor Matheson, professor of comparative mythology at Yale University, the Blackwater Valley case represents a convergence of folkloric elements found in numerous cultures worldwide. What's remarkable, she notes in her 2018 paper on the subject, is not just the consistency of the reported phenomena, but how they align with accounts from diverse traditions, from the hidden people of Norse mythology to the Ibu Gogo of Indonesian folklore. There is a universal archetype here of entities that exist alongside humanity, but according to different physical laws, beings that can be perceived only peripherally, that avoid direct observation, and that exhibit a fascination with human intruders in their domain. Matheson's research team attempted to gain permission for a limited archaeological survey of the valley in 2019, but was denied access by Forest Service officials who cited ongoing environmental sensitivity studies in the Podge area. When pressed for details about these studies, officials acknowledged no such projects were currently active, but insisted the restrictions would remain in place indefinitely. The pattern of official obstruction extends beyond academic inquiries. In 1973, a documentary filmmaker named Richard Kelsey began production on a feature about the Blackwater Valley incident, including interviews with descendants of the survivors and extensive historical research. According to his production notes, preserved in the University of Montana Film Studies Archive, Kelsey had secured permission to film in certain areas adjacent to the restricted zone, but was warned against any attempt to enter the valley itself. 2 weeks into filming, Kelsey reported equipment malfunctions that defied explanation. Batteries drained instantly, film came back fogged or blank. Audio recordings contained nothing but static despite perfect recording conditions. After relocating to Helena to continue interviews with Historical Society staff, Kelsey experienced what he described as a home invasion, though nothing was stolen except his research materials and film footage. The project was abandoned shortly thereafter. In 1985, a group of paranormal investigators led by Dr. Martin Blackwood attempted to conduct an unauthorized expedition into the valley, equipped with various measurement instruments and early night vision technology. Their venture received some media attention when local authorities issued warnings about the potential legal consequences of trespassing in a restricted federal wilderness area. What happened to the group remains unclear. They were never apprehended by law enforcement, but neither did they emerge from the forest as planned. A search and rescue operation discovered their vehicle at a remote trailhead, but found no trace of the team themselves. The disappearance of the Blackwood expedition briefly revived public interest in the Blackwater Valley mystery, but coverage quickly faded amid official statements emphasizing the dangers of wilderness exploration by untrained individuals and the legal penalties for violating federal land use restrictions. No further search efforts were conducted after the initial week, and the case was classified as a presumed wilderness accident by the county sheriff's department. The most recent development in this ongoing mystery occurred in 2018, when a hiker who had strayed beyond the permitted trails near but not within the restricted Blackwater Valley area discovered an old steel trap half buried in sediment along the stream bank. The trap, identified by experts as consistent with models used in the 1890s, was taken to the Montana Historical Society for preservation. During cleaning, conservators found something etched into the metal of the spring mechanism, a series of crude letters that appeared to have been carved with a knife point. The inscription read simply, "Still Here." Below it was a pattern of vertical lines crossed by a horizontal wave. The hiker who discovered the trap reported experiencing persistent nightmares in the months following his find. In these dreams, he described standing in a forest clearing surrounded by impossibly tall, thin figures that moved only when he wasn't looking directly at them. He sought psychiatric help after beginning to see the same figures while awake. All was in his peripheral vision. All was gone when he turned to face them directly. His current whereabouts are unknown. His family reported him missing in late 2019 after he failed to return from what he described as a personal research trip to Montana. His vehicle was found at a trailhead approximately 15 miles from the borders of the restricted Blackwater Valley area. Despite an extensive search, no other trace of him has been discovered. In the realm of unexplained phenomena, the Blackwater Valley incident stands apart for its longevity, consistency, and the unusual degree of apparent institutional suppression surrounding it. While most mysterious events fade into obscurity or are eventually explained through advances in scientific understanding, This case has remained stubbornly resistant to conventional explanation for over a century. Perhaps most disturbing is the pattern of disappearances that continues despite restrictive measures, suggesting that whatever dwells in the valley is neither contained by arbitrary boundaries nor deterred by human awareness of its presence. If anything, attention seems to attract it, as if the act of perception itself creates a connection that transcends physical distance. Whatever happened in those remote woods in the winter of 1893 remains buried in the shadows of history, its truth as elusive as the whispers that survivors reported hearing on the wind. But perhaps that uncertainty is a blessing. Some mysteries, once fully illuminated, might prove more terrible than we can bear to comprehend.